that? Will that go away?
Yeah. So like I said, I'm going to talk about React hooks, and this says in 15 minutes. I would like to make a slight addendum to this and say 15 minutes or so, maybe. Let's say 20 minutes. This is a little bit about me. There's a lot of jokes on here, but I'm just going to say I'm a senior software engineer at Granular. We make farming business software. I do a lot of coding in React and Angular, as well as Python, just like regular Node stuff. And yeah, moving on to what you came here to hear about, which is React hooks. Well, but okay, let's back up a little bit. Before we talk about hooks, let's talk about React. So React is a mildly popular front-end framework used by a handful of developers to build modern UI in JavaScript. So you can use React on the web, you can use it on phones like Android and iPhones. Does Windows Phone still exist? I don't know if you can use it there or not, but maybe. So they do claim that it's learn once, write anywhere, which is kind of true. So the whole premise of React is that it is sort of, it uses functional paradigms to allow you to write your UI. So there's a unidirectional data flow. And I'm going to throw out a couple of keywords here just to sort of get everyone familiar with what we're going to be talking about tonight. So in React, you have these things called components. And components encapsulate your UI logic. Components can include many subcomponents. Components can include native elements in your UI. So when you're talking about web, that can be spans, that can be blink tags, that can be buttons, inputs, anything you want. So what comes into a component is two different types of data. You can have, well, what comes into a component is one type of data, and that is props. Props are read-only. They're handed to you by the parent. You are not allowed to edit them. And then on another important type of data on a component is state. State is something that you keep track of. It's mutable, and you can touch it. And so the React runtime uses props and states in order to figure out how to, or I should say rather, when to update lower level components and certain parts of the UI. And this allows it to be very efficient and to only re-render certain parts of the UI when necessary. One other thing to point out here is that React has always used the cutting edge JavaScript specs, which is part of what makes it so fun to use. And it's been around for over 5 years now. So if you started using React when it first came out, you can finally claim more than 5 years of React experience on your resume. Get those recruiters on you. So I have not been using React for quite 5 years, but pretty close. I dug around in my GitHub history and I found a project where the last commit was in 2015. And this might be a little bit hard to read from the back. It's a lot clearer on, moderate. But anyway, this is what a React component looked like in 2015. So I'm just going to walk through it real quick because these are going to be like common things that we see even today. So the first thing you'll see up there is that we have a function called react.create class, and this tells React that we're creating a component. Inside here, if you look down about halfway, you'll see this get initial state. This is just how you define an object to represent what your state looks like when you first initialize your component. Below that, we have a render method. And so render is actually a React method where we tell it what we want to display. In this case, I have a single conditional that checks some values in my state, and depending on what they are, it renders either an edit button or an add button. And if you look closely at, say, the edit button, you'll see that I give the edit button some of my own state and some of my own props. So I'm intermingling state and props to give to my subcomponent, my child component, which will receive them both as its own props. They'll be read-only. Anything else here? So up at the top in the onSave function, we call this .setState, which is how you actually change and manipulate your own state methods. So fast forward to today. And I went ahead and refactored that old component to use the sorts of patterns that we would use in 2019 to create a React component. This should look very similar to what we just saw about React using the latest JavaScript specs. you can see at the very top we're now creating a class that extends the React component class, where we previously used get initial state to define our initial state. Now we're setting our initial state in a constructor. We have a bound function for that onSave property, and I'm using fancy ES decorators, one that Chad used in last month's CUJS. Come to all of our events, because then you'll get these little inside things. Inside of that bound function, we're actually using what's called functional set state, which is a newish thing, and that functional set state ensures that our state will be updated in the order in which the calls were received. And then our render is actually identical, except that I changed things to a ternary because, I don't know, I got a little bit ahead of myself when I was refactoring. So we don't always need state, right? So sometimes you just need like a little component, something that doesn't do very much, maybe something that all it does is render some DOM. In this case, I have a cancel account button. And all that it is a button with a span tag in it that has like a little icon and then some text. And so these are really simple. All it is what I've got here is an arrow function. It takes in a single prop called onClick, which it assigns to the button's onClick handler, and then just returns the DOM that it's going to use. These are referred to as functional components, and you may be familiar with calling them stateless components, but for reasons you'll see shortly, you should maybe refrain from calling them stateless components. Because you pretty much always end up refactoring a functional component to need state. As it grows, as your project grows, except for the like very lowest level things, eventually you're going to find yourself in a situation where you say, oh, like I really need to use lifecycle method, I really need to use state. And this is a big pain in the butt. So let's present a situation, just a little scenario. So marketing comes to us, is that Jeff playing? Score. Marketing comes to us and they say, hey, engineering, we know that you guys implemented that cancel account button last week, and we've been scouring through the analytics, and we found that that cancel account button is the primary reason for our revenue loss. We lose a subscription every time someone clicks cancel account. That button we need to make sure that you, thanks. So we need users to understand, we want them to truly understand what it means when they're clicking this button, because maybe they don't recognize the value that they're getting from our service, and so we want to make extra sure that they know that they're going to lose their account. So design, marketing, product, us, for some reason the CEO's there, we all get together in a room and we come up with this design. We say that every time a user is going to click a button multiple times, then the button will cycle through different messages based on how desperate we are to keep them. When we finally exhausted all of our messages, we'll go ahead and cancel the account because we're not pure evil yet. So I know that little zoom indicator is in the way. This says refactoring into a class component, my bad. So what I've done here is I've taken our original functional component and I made it into a class component to have the state that we needed. And I know this is a lot of code, and that's the point, by the way. Hold on. So let's just walk through this real quick. So again, we've changed our function into a class. We're extending the React component class. We've added a constructor. We have to call super. It's required. We set our initial state with our button text as cancel and our click set to 0. Let's walk down to the bottom here where we have our render function. It's largely the same, except that now in place of our cancel text, we now show whatever the current state of the button text is. And instead of the old onClick handler, we are now actually going to call set state with the next number of clicks. And so whenever we call that set state, what's going to happen is a lifecycle function is going to be called. Because our state was updated, our component is going to want to re-render. So we have component did update here, and that's called every time a component is rendered, except for the first time, which we would use component did mount to do that. And in this function, we have to sort of beat around the bush a little bit, and we have to first verify that the number of clicks is what changed, And if it did change, then we're going to check that we have more messages than clicks. And if so, then we're going to update the button text. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and call our pass-through prop on click so that the user can finally cancel their account. And this is admittedly a lot of code for doing very little, although retention, I mean, give up any kind of code quality for that, right? If only there were a better way to do that, maybe a brand new way to do that. Hooks is the answer to our problem. So I took that old functional component, I went back on a second pass of adding a state to this class or to this component, and I did it in hooks. And the first thing I want you to notice is that this is about half the code of creating a class component. So you'll notice a couple of new pieces of syntax here. We're going to sort of zoom in on a couple of different parts of this code to talk about what it's doing. So the first thing that you'll see is useState. And so this is how you declare state variables using React hooks. So here we call useState, and it will return to us a state variable and a set. So in this case, we have two state variables, clicks and button text. We use the parameter to use the first parameter into useState to tell it what the initial state should be for the values. In our case, for clicks, we want it to be 0. We want to know it's an integer, so we can later add to it. And for button text, we don't really care what it is. We're just going to let it be null or undefined. And then we also get these setters that we set aside. So what this does is it hooks our component, this instance of our component, into the React runtime. And every time that the component is re-rendered, it'll essentially ask, hey, has this instance already gotten its state variable? And if it has, it will return us that state variable associated with this instance. So zooming back out, we see the next thing on our list is a useEffect. UseEffect is also part of the Hooks API. And useEffect essentially, it's component did mount and component did update combined. So it's all the lifecycle methods that we should need for a regular component. UseEffect will be being called every render. You should recognize this logic if you squinted at the last slide with the class component as being pretty much the same. We're checking to see if we have more messages than clicks, and if we do, we're going to update the button text, and if we don't, we're going to call this onClickProp, and that's it. You can see what we don't have here is the check to see if clicks actually changed. And that's what this second parameter to useEffect is, the array with clicks inside of it. The second parameter is a list of state variables to watch. And if those state variables have changed, then this effect will be fired. Otherwise, it will be ignored. So one thing to note here is that we're using sort of the power of closures to access all of these things, so we don't have to deal with this. We don't have to deal with any binding or anything like that. We just sort of already have all of these values because they're coming from the function that defines this effect. You can and should define as many hooks as you, or as many effects as you want inside of your component to do things like separate different concerns. So like if I want to change another state variable based on the fact that messages change, that should be done in a different effect. And that way, you can sort of see, you can read your function like you would a page. So yeah, so you'll see the render is pretty much the same. Like I said, we use the setClicks function now instead of using setState, and we're using the button text function directly instead of using the state button text. And so this is really cool in my opinion, because first we cut our code approximately in half from the class component. And I find this much, much more readable. You can sort of read it from top to bottom now. And you can see exactly what should be happening. So great. Marketing loves our new button. Retention improved for some reason. We probably introduced a bug somewhere where the cancel never actually happens. I don't know. But anyway, they love it. And they say, hey, we should do this on more pages. What if, like, let's talk about our EULA. We worry that no one actually reads our EULA. They just check the checkbox and then click agree and then click go on. So we want them to say, like, click the checkbox, and then the button text will change and say, I really agree. And then you click it again and it'll say, yeah, no, like, I actually read it. No. But, Yeah, so what if we wanted to do that? How could we reuse this logic? So there's a concept of custom hooks. And again, I know that this text is maybe a little bit small, but so what we can do is extract entire effects out of our component. And you can see here what I've got is a useTextByCount hook. And what this does is it declares its own state variable, text, which from before is the button text. It's akin to that. And then we have the same useEffect, but we're using slightly different variable names. And then we're returning the current state of text. And then if you look in the cancel account deletion button, we now only are keeping track of one state variable, and that's clicks. Button text comes to us from this custom hook, and we don't even know that it's a state variable, and we don't care. We just use it. And so that's cut out another 12, 14 lines. We put this out, we take this into a lib file. We realize that the whole world wants it. We MIT license it and put it up on NPM. And then we take it out of our code base entirely. And so what this has done is it's allowed us to reuse stateful or lifecycle management logic, which traditionally in a class component is really hard. Because you've got to think about this. You've got to think about other sort of effects that are happening in a component that update. And we've done that really simply and easily with hooks. So as we're starting to wrap up here, there are some rules, and they're pretty simple. So the first rule is only call hooks at the top level. So don't use hooks in conditionals, don't use them in loops. And we want this because so the way that the React runtime returns state variables to you is by the order in which they are called. So if you call your hooks in a different order, so you call useState in a different order, then you're going to get state variables returned to you in a very unexpected ways. Just don't do it. It's easy enough just to declare them all in one way every time. The second rule is only call hooks from React functions, and that way the runtime can properly sort of hook into them and figure out what's going on. So in React function components and custom hooks, how do you know that something is a custom hook? You should always prefix your custom hooks with the use prefix. And then you can use this fancy ESLint plugin that the React devs made. And what this will do is it will say, hey, you're using hooks in the wrong place. Or hey, you're using hooks in a conditional. So I think it's pretty obvious why hooks. Traditionally in class components, it's hard to reuse stateful logic. So you have to think about this. You have to think about all the other side effects that may need to be called. Complex components become hard to understand really fast. So the difference between our 30-line hooks component and our 60-line class component, like, it's just kind of slog to read through it and you fall asleep. Like the bigger a component gets, the more difficult it is to understand. And classes confuse both people and machines. Like, even the most seasoned JavaScript developer still has trouble understanding like what this is and why they have to bind functions. And classes, especially in React, are not really the most natural way to go because you're inheriting from the React.component class, but like you never inherit from a component that you create, right? Like, I mean, I never do. So it just seems like a weird kind of mismatch of the way that things are actually working and sort of against the paradigms that the React developers have presented for us. And I also think classes can confuse machines. So minifiers and transpilers have a lot of trouble with classes still, partially because they're so new and so there hasn't been time to optimize for these things. But yeah, so like right now, your bundle size could be slightly smaller if everything was functions instead of classes. Don't hold me to that though, because if you add in the React Hooks API, your bundle will actually probably get a little bit bigger. Anyway, so what did we learn today? Hooks allow us to use state and lifecycle management without classes. Hooks allow us to reuse lifecycle logic. I'm just reading all this. Hooks cut my code in half. Hooks can be easier on a minifier. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that hooks are completely opt-in and backwards compatible. So what I don't want you to do tonight is to go home and make a bunch of JIRA tickets to convert all your class components to functional components with hooks, because I don't want your manager to hate you and I don't want your manager to hate me. It's not necessary. What I do want you to do is the next time that you're using a functional component and you need to refactor to have state, is to consider using hooks instead and see if you can do it more easily and with less work. Hooks just came out in React 16.8, which was released February 6th, 5th, something like that. In fact, I had a disclaimer slide in here when I first started writing these that said, hey, this is an alpha. Anything I say could be wrong in a month. But now everything I say is true. So believe it all. Any questions before I ran a little bit over? But are there any questions that are easy, not hard, like about testing deep nested things? Cool. So feel free to talk to me during the intermission or after the event. And I would love to talk to you about React and how you're using React. And if you've used hooks in production, because that'd be a really cool thing to know. Here's all the resources for this talk. And thank you very much for your time. So now we're going to take a short 5-minute intermission while Eric gets set up, and feel free to eat more and wipe out the drinks, and see you soon.